First thing, I just want to thank Jan Harzan. I want to thank everyone at MUFON who was responsible for getting me here. It's been a little while. I'm very happy to be back here. I'm here with my wonderful fiancée, Tracy. She doesn't have to stand up, but many of you have met her. I'm very happy that she's here. I see many familiar faces. It's a real joy for me to be here. So thank you on that basis. I'm going to do my very best to stay on time here. We've already started a little bit behind, and I have a little bit more than I probably should have prepared for you. So let me just start with my preliminary word. Thank you, Jen. Is this better? Okay. Oh, good. Okay, very good. I've never done a conference that had quite as much anticipation for me and for a few other people as this one. I have to say that right off the bat. And it has to do with the secret space program. I've said this publicly not long ago. I had an article that I published dealing in part with this event, and not to stir up controversy. I'm not interested in stirring up controversy at all. But partly I was unable to avoid it. When I realized that I was going to be on a panel with other individuals whose opinions I don't fully share, and that's just how it is, I thought, well, I'm going to have to, at some point, put my own position out there vis-a-vis theirs. And so I've done that in a few interviews, and as it happens in our field, word gets around, and the next thing you know, people are predicting some kind of cage match on the panel, and I don't think that's going to happen either. But what I will just say, relating to secret space program, which I'm a firm believer in, I'm a believer. There's a lot I don't have knowledge of. See, that's the thing. I think that there's a very good hypothesis to be made for it. I'm going to present that to you. I'm not out to take anyone down. I'm not out to have fights with anyone. I'm truly not interested in that, and that's why I avoid it most of the time. I just wasn't able to avoid it this time. So my attitude is I always want to go through this field as respectfully as I can, and no hard feelings. And if someone critiques what I say, that's perfectly fine. If I have to critique what they say, I'd like to think that's perfectly fine as well. As far as the UFO evidence and for secret space program, this is 101 here. Many of you are long past that very basic level of UFO knowledge, but some of you aren't. And I just want to point out to you, if you really are wondering what's all this hubbub about in the UFO field, is there anything that you can hang your hat on in terms of solid evidence? The answer is yes. Of course, there's a lot. On my own website and elsewhere as well. There's a lot of analyses of those particular documents, and that's just a beginning. There are hundreds of excellent documents that we have access to through Freedom of Information. I would encourage you, in your spare time, to go look at them. Some are boring. They're not all interesting. Some are fascinating. The ones that I have on that, you can go to Richard Dolan Press and just take a look. I have an article that details what is important about those documents. And because time is a bit tight, I don't want to go into all the details except to say that you are talking about high-level discussions about the reality of the UFO topic by people who have significant national security duties and responsibilities. We're talking four-star generals. We're talking scientific directors of the CIA, people at that level who are acknowledging the reality of this phenomenon of unknown objects, unconventional capabilities, exceptional capabilities over sensitive airspace, and not really knowing what to do about it. So that's a good starting point. That doesn't prove that UFOs are extraterrestrials, but it does prove that it's an important phenomenon worth the attention of any citizen who cares about truth in their society. So it's a thing. UFOs are absolutely a thing, and if I were on MSNBC or Fox News or CNN, I could say that just as confidently there as I'm telling you right here. Now, moving on to the to space. All right. The first thing that we have to say relating to any kind of space programs is that the United States military has never and will never voluntarily give up its domination of space as a platform of activity. No matter what you ever hear about NASA not doing manned missions or this or that, that's always a separate thing from what the United States military will do. The U.S. military cannot command the world without dominating space. It's not possible. All the exact missiles and the smart bombs and everything else that they've got are not going to be useful without dominating space as a theater of operations. It is the center of gravity, as you will. So with that said, no matter what you hear about in the public domain relating to space activities, you have to know that the military is out there in force. They've got hundreds of satellites. You've got other nations that want to take those satellites down, and there's a need to defend them. So you'll always have an escalation of military activity in space. 15, 16 years ago, if you remember the disclosure conference that took place at the National Press Club in May of '01, there were many people talking about the need to ban space-based weapons, and they may have had really good intentions, but it was a completely it was a fool's errand to think that it would ever happen, because the nature of the military is such that space is always going to be a major theater of operations, and it will never be demilitarized. Never. And if the U.S. were to demilitarize its space presence, other nations would gladly fill in the gap, and they're already trying to do that. So that's what's going on there. Now, as far as what's going on in space, this is an open question, at least officially speaking. We've got everyone's got their own take on what they think is happening in space. There have been, in fact, last night, Michael Sala referred to the program out of Vandenberg Air Force Base. That is true. And I'm sure there's even more than that. But the fact is, you've got a presence in space that is of military importance. And the question is, what are the technologies that they have out there? One thing that I've been interested in for a little while is looking at the moon. This is Carl Wolf. A lot of people know who this man is. Carl Wolf was with the U.S. Air Force back in the mid-'60s. He's gone on the record many times about his experience in 1965. He had a top-secret crypto clearance. He was assigned to an NSA facility, which he said he thought was NASA. No one knew what the NSA was, very few people in 1965. And talked many times and repeatedly and very consistently about when he was there. Spoke with another airman who said, we've gotten images back from lunar orbiter back to Earth, digital images, some of the earliest ones. And he says, by the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon. Wolf many times has said he got scared because he knew he wasn't cleared for the information. The guy pulled out a mosaic showing the base, he said, which had all these geometric shapes and towers and so forth. And you can see it on YouTube. One thing you have to know about this is, officially speaking, the first images that we have from the far side of the moon were actually from 1967, not 1965. So there are reasons that people will discredit this testimony. And that may not be, could be that he got his date wrong. He misremembered. Who knows? Probably not. But there are other people who might suggest, well, maybe there was covert images that came back to the NSA. I don't really know the answer to this, but that is his story, and he has maintained it, that there are anomalies on the moon. He's not the only one. Buzz Aldrin has talked about this, the object that did the object follow Apollo 11 on the way to the moon. Well, Buzz Aldrin put this little statement out after saying nothing for 40 years. He said, I saw this illumination that was moving with respect to the stars. We were smart enough to not say, Houston, there's a light out there that's following us. Shortly after that, he made a retraction, and it was not supposed to be anything extraordinary. Ken Johnson, who's here, I saw him yesterday. I'm very glad that he's here. Former manager of data and photo control department at NASA, has made this statement. While Neil and Buzz were on the lunar surface, Neil switched to the medical channel and spoke directly to the chief medical officer, saying, they're here, they're parked on the side of the crater, and they're watching us. Maurice Chatelain, former NASA employee, had many patents to his name. There were attempts to discredit him as a low-level employee at NASA, contractor. I don't find that convincing. He seems that he was very, very significant enough to know what he was talking about. Said essentially the same thing. Armstrong and Aldrin reported 2 UFOs on the rim of a crater. He says all Apollo and Gemini flights were followed both at a distance and sometimes also quite closely by space vehicles of an extraterrestrial origin. And they were ordered to silence on that. This is one of many images. I don't know what to make of some of these images that we get from anomalies that are in space. This is from a website called thelivingmoon.com. It's Apollo 11, one of these objects leaving Earth's atmosphere. Donna Hare, a credible person that I would qualify as a genuine whistleblower. We know Donna Hare's background very, very well. She was a technical illustrator with Philco Ford, which was a contractor for NASA. She had a secret clearance during the early 1970s. She had a couple of things that she said. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on her testimony. She was shown a satellite photo with a picture with a distinct UFO, which she was told NASA regularly airbrushed out of the photographs before they were released to the public. No UFOs in NASA pictures. So Donna Hare made this statement based on what she was told from a trusted source within NASA. She also had information that some of the astronauts had seen extraterrestrial craft on the moon. So she heard the stories. So if nothing else, within NASA in circa 1970, a lot of stories were floating around, circulating, about astronauts seeing extraterrestrials or encountering extraterrestrial craft. If nothing else, this seems to have been a significant thing going on in NASA at that time. She said, I believe there were 3 on the moon when they landed. I think she's talking about Apollo 11. The code word for UFOs was Santa Claus. She also talked about a man that she was dating at the time who was in quarantine with the astronauts when they came back from the moon. By the way, Donna Hare gave this in an interview with former MUFON State Director of Utah, Elaine Douglas, and many people remember Elaine. I remember Elaine. Elaine ran this interview back in the mid-90s with Donna Hare. You can find it on YouTube. So during the interview, Donna Hare talked about having talked to him if he had heard anything about like UFOs on the moon and so forth. And he told her every astronaut, every moon trip had been followed by craft, she said, by saucers. And added they'd been told to keep quiet about it. They were threatened with jail and so forth. So that was her 1995 radio interview she did with Elaine Douglas of MUFON. It's a significant interview, I think. There are other things indicating that there's something odd about the moon. George Leonard did a book a long time ago. He's with NASA, photo analyst. He had his book called Somebody Else is on the Moon. These photos are all low res. What was interesting to me is his statement that the NASA program really was, the Kennedy initiative to get to the moon, rather, was driven by secret discoveries made by Earth-based telescopes proving activity on the moon. So a fellow named Vito Secchieri read George Leonard's book a couple of years later in the late 70s, goes with another engineer friend of his. They're both engineers, Lester Howes. They go to Houston's NASA headquarters and ask to see the moon photos. NASA had to check with Langley, Virginia, according to Vito, CIA. This was approved. They had strict rules. They had 3 8-hour days that they were allowed. No writing, no recording devices. They could not be left alone with photographs. And what Secchieri saw was, quote, in his words, obvious machinery on the surface showing bolted sections, a UFO rising from the surface and photographed directly above a crater, the unmistakable figure of a rectangular structure placed squarely in the biggest crater pictured, a perfect three-dimensional view. He went on. He said that he was allowed to examine transcripts of the manned space flights, including the moon landings, and this is what he reads. Houston, we've got a bogey at 2 o'clock. Roger that. Apollo, switching to Alpha, roll 8 degrees and begin sequence. And then another one where he read, mission control, we've got Santa Claus coming over the hill. Roger, Apollo, hold your fix. Switching, Bravo, do you copy? Roger, Houston, Bravo, link. Alpha and Bravo were different switching stations, enabling secure communications. So they saw a UFO, switched to a secure station. Story that I've told a few times. I hope it doesn't get old for you. It's a good one. I was lucky to know Ingo Swann. I once spent an evening in his home. If you don't know who Ingo Swann was, he was probably the most famous of the remote viewers out of the Stanford research program in the 70s. He was very much a legend in his lifetime. He's passed away. So Ingo Swann was such a good remote viewer back in the early 70s. He was bored. He walked into the office, this is well recorded, office of Hal Puthoff, and said, "I'm bored. I'm tired of looking at Soviet submarines in the water. Let's do something interesting." So they decided to remote view Jupiter before our first satellite reached Jupiter. They thought it'd be a good test for Ingo's ability. Famously, he recorded, I think it was 13 distinct data points about Jupiter, none of which were known, or many of which were not suspected. 12 of the 13 have since been confirmed, including the existence of a planetary ring. In other words, Ingo Swann saw Jupiter's ring before anyone else knew about it, before it was confirmed. That made him famous within the black world, within the secret world, and as a result of that, word got out, and everyone wanted his work. You got a remote viewer of that quality. So we got all kinds of crazy phone calls, and he was used to it. He gets one phone call from a sort of a acquaintance who said, "If you get a phone call from this particular office, from a Mr. Axelrod, take the assignment, do whatever they say." Ingo's like, "Well, okay, whatever." A few weeks go by, he gets it late at night. They want him to be in Washington, D.C. the next day at noon. He's in New York City. Long story short, he goes, he's there. He gets taken to a very bizarre underground facility. He's face to face with this very strange man, Axelrod. And Axelrod says, "Ingo, what do you know about the moon?" Ingo Swann said, "Well, not much. I know it's out there." That was about it. That was at the time. Ingo Swann really knew nothing about the moon. He's asked to do remote viewing of the moon, near side and far side, and remote views, objects, beings, and the like. He says, "I think they're looking at me." Axelrod says, "Come away from there quickly." Ingo Swann did remote viewing for an entire week in this underground facility with the mysterious Axelrod, and had a few other encounters with Axelrod, which are quite fascinating. We don't have time for here. But again, not everyone looks at remote viewing as, "Oh, wow, it's got to be true." I've been interested in remote viewing. I make no secret about it, mainly because I think that there's very good, very overwhelming evidence that there's something valid and true about remote viewing enough to make me conclude, I don't know why it works, but I know that it works much of the time. And what got me interested in it is the fact that many of these remote viewers were seeing apparent extraterrestrial craft and beings, very common. And so I thought I'd like to know what they are finding out. So this is one such story from Ingo Swann, and this had to do with the moon. I will tell you an interesting conversation, and I've repeated this once or a couple of times, that I had with Russell Targ, who is one of the main people who organized the remote viewing program at Stanford Research Institute. A number of years ago, I was chatting with Russell on the phone, and he just threw this out at me. He said, "Richard, back in the early 1980s, I was tasked by a group out of I was tasked to train remote viewers at Fort Meade, Maryland, whose job was to remote view the far side of the moon." Long pause. I'm thinking, how do I follow up with this obvious next question I want to ask? So I said, "Well, Russell, why would they be looking at the far side of the moon?" I wanted him to tell me. He said, "Well, why do you think?" And I said, "All right, I'll bite. Were they going to look for extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon?" I figured I had to ask. He said, he didn't say no, he didn't say maybe. He said yes. That was their job. They were going to look for extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon in the early 1980s. Next question I asked, well, did they find extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon? And he said, "Well, that I don't know. That wasn't part of my assignment." So whether he knows or not, I don't know, but that's what he said to me. I've always believed him in that conversation. I've never had a reason to think that he was making that up. And you really have to ask yourself, if you're going to be training remote viewers to look for extraterrestrials on the far side of the moon, I'm going to assume you have reason to think that they have something, a reason that they're going to find extraterrestrials. You have Edgar Mitchell, who's no longer with us. Many of us here knew Edgar Mitchell. You know, it's interesting about him. He made a few very strong statements during the late 90s going into the 2000s, and I could really see he backed away from that position in his last few years. Here he's saying, I have no doubt that extraterrestrials could very well have populated or made structures on the far side of the moon. Well, I'm going to tell you what Edgar Mitchell once said to me personally, directly, and he also said publicly back in 1997. In fact, it was recorded in one of the issues of the MUFON Journal. You can go back and find it. Edgar Mitchell stated explicitly that he had two ultra-elite connections, and when you're an Apollo 14 astronaut, who's not going to want to be your buddy? He can talk to anyone he wanted to. He had two ultra-elite connections who told him explicitly, he said, about our recovery of extraterrestrial technology and bodies. You have an Apollo moonwalking astronaut who says this. It's not to be taken lightly, and any of you who knew Edgar Mitchell know that he was razor sharp his entire life. He was not delusional, and this is what he said. And it was an amazing thing to me that the mainstream media, well, why should it be amazing, really, but that they would ignore him and belittle this statement. He made it several times. No one ever properly followed up with this in our mainstream media. I think the reasons are very self-evident. So that's a little bit about the moon. You've got some very good individual testimony that gives us reason to think, there's something very important going on here. There's something out there in Earth orbit and beyond that would give us at least a very good reason to have a secret space program, wouldn't it? If you're tracking the UFO phenomenon, and it's not only here on our surface, but out in space, out in orbit, and you're doing a serious investigation you don't want the world to know about, you're going to have, if for no other reason, you're going to have a secret space program for that reason. You have to. You have to have a clandestine effort to monitor and somehow deal with that presence. Then there's tracking deep space. This is Simone Mendez. She was in the United States Air Force during the early 1980s, and I talked with Simone Mendez a number of years ago. Her story is somewhat well known. It should be better known. She was with telecommunications specialists at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada in the early 80s. She had a top secret clearance. All of this is confirmed. In October 1981, she was given a top secret message stating, brace yourself, that NORAD had detected deep space objects entering Earth's atmosphere. As a result of having this unauthorized information, life became a living hell for Simone Mendez. She's talked about this from time to time. She went through, to call it interrogation would be an understatement. It was borderline harassment and more by the Air Force and FBI. This is a declassified Freedom of Information Act document about Simone Mendez, indicating that she did have a top secret clearance and received extremely sensitive material. This is another secret declassified document about her, dealing with, there's her name, Simone Cherise Mendez in there. It was noted that she did receive an apparent classified document, that's how they describe it, blacked out, dealing with UFOs over the Soviet Union. So that's a little bit of additional data there, that apparently NORAD detected a deep space object entering Earth's atmosphere over the Soviet Union, apparently. There's Ron Regehr. Many people know Ron over from Utah. I'm a very big admirer of his work. Ron Regehr worked for Aerojet, a defense contractor, for many years on this program, the Defense Satellite Program, DSP. This is a series of geosynchronous satellites that the Defense Department has set up to, officially speaking, to monitor the launching of missiles to detect, in event of Russians launching missiles at us and so forth. What Ron argued I thought very, very well, frankly, is that these satellites were also ideally designed for tracking UFOs in Earth orbit and Earth atmosphere. There are about 24 of them, if I'm not mistaken, or thereabouts, around the globe. The database that Ron got access to, he was not authorized, but he got it legally. It was accidental but legal, I guess is how the best way to put it. Is tracks all of the fast walkers and UFOs that the DSP tracked. I included this in volume 2 of one of my books, UFOs in a National Security State. And from 1973 to 1991, that DSP program tracked something like 283, I believe, fast walkers. About, I think it was like one a month that it tracked. Now, not all of them are extraterrestrial craft, but some of them were very, very unusual. One of the things that defense satellite tracked was the famous UFO over Tehran, Iran in 1976. That was confirmed by a DSP satellite. Very interesting little data point there. Well, one of the interesting things that the DSP system tracked was this deep space object, again, object coming in from deep space to within 1 or 2 or 3 kilometers at the most of one of the satellites. And you see the drawing of where it came in and then left Earth orbit, came in, hung out for a little while, and then left on May 5th, 1984. Then you have, this is a little short video clip, another 1984 anomaly. I have always found this fascinating. I don't know what other researchers thought about it. I once talked with Bruce Maccabee about this, optical physicist, PhD. Bruce was sort of on the fence about this, but I spent a lot of time myself looking at this very carefully. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to show you this little clip. And it was from YouTube, and they rewind it and they zoom in, so you'll get to see it a couple of times. This is 1984. You watch this object coming in. Comes in. It's going to come in again. I mean, that's definitely a 3-dimensional object. And I will tell you also, I spent... how scientific I am. I spent time measuring the object on my screen to see, does it get larger as it comes closer? And it does. It gets a little bit larger as it comes to the screen. So to me, I mean, my logical assumption is that this is an object out there and it's coming toward the craft. Whatever it is, don't know, but it looked large. This is another very interesting clip. This is from the late Jeff Challenger, who got this off of the NASA feed. Jeff was out of Sacramento, a very, very dedicated guy who spent an enormous amount of time downloading and analyzing NASA video footage, and not just NASA, but also the European Space Station and the Russians as well. And this is one from the STS shuttle mission 114 from 2005, not that long ago. You'll see an object doing a U-turn in Earth orbit, and here it is. Watch. This is sped up, by the way. The original is quite a bit slower than this. You see it moving back. There's an enhancement of this, which I don't have, which zooms. I think Jeff did it, actually. I should replay it for you sometime. But where you see the object, it's the frame is stabilized, and you see the object close up. And it's not just moving. It's actually doing small S movements as it goes forward and then back. It's very, very interesting. There are always critics, there are always skeptics and debunkers of these types of videos. I don't know how to explain that particular one. It looks sure as heck like a U-turn in space to me. So the obvious question that we ask, and there's so many, we could spend this entire conference with every single speaker giving yet more stories of U.S. astronauts, Russian cosmonauts, accounts of unusual and unexplainable objects that they see in orbit, and we just can't do it all. But the real question is, are these ours or are they not ours? That's the logical question. Are we making these things or are we not making these things? My suspicion all along is that it's a little of column A and a little bit of column B. But either way, the obvious implication is that this would require a secret space program, because clearly if other beings have a presence on the moon, or if other beings are doing acrobatics in Earth orbit while we've got our satellites there, clearly the military is going to need to deal with that in some responsible way. And of course, if we're making these things, or if our military is making these things, that would rather prove you have a secret space program right away. The idea of crash retrievals, I want to talk a little bit about this. It's not directly related to the secret space program, but it does provide a foundation for our own exotic technology program. Leonard Stringfield, of course, was a UFO researcher, died back in the 1990s, wrote, was one of the people, along with Stanton Friedman, to revive interest in Roswell and crash retrievals, did a great deal of work on this, and really was a sort of a clearinghouse among many people from the military who came to him with stories of crash retrievals of UFOs. And now, having been in this field long enough, it's very easy for me to see how that would happen. Stringfield got known within the community for looking into these stories, and it just became a flood of all these people who came to him with their stories of various types of crash retrievals. And I'll just talk about a couple of these. These are some of the many stories Stringfield collected, just a few. Not just Roswell. This one, he got one from 1957, supposedly with 4 bodies recovered. A doctor, Stringfield talked a lot about this doctor who was in New York City, who talked to him about having autopsied alien bodies. A great deal of description in this. And again, not everyone, the research community, believed Stringfield. And Stringfield himself, you know, to his credit, always was willing to say, look, I don't know for sure either, but these are the people that I'm getting, and I'm doing my best to vet them. So many of these, and honestly, I don't know how many we really want to go into, but if you've got your cell phone, take a picture, and you can look over it later. You've got the whole Wilbur Smith, Robert Sarbacher, Eric Walker saga. This was written about at length by Grant Cameron, talked about by Grant and myself and other people. Long story short, Wilbur Smith was a Canadian scientist, government official, kind of a mid to upper level official with the Canadian Department of Transport in the 1950s, deeply interested in UFOs. In fact, talked about his own contact experiences, telepathic. Wilbur Smith was a fascinating man, well worth looking into. He visits the United States in 1950. He goes to the United States, to the Canadian Embassy, and is in D.C., and meets with a highly classified, a prominent scientist on the classified subject of UFOs. He wrote a memo back to his government about this. You can read the memo, it's online. He talks about this subject being the most highly classified subject, higher than the H-bomb. In 1950, that was kind of an important thing to say. For many years, none of this was known. The memo Smith wrote became publicized, I think, around late 70s, early 80s. But still no one knew who the scientist was who he spoke to until Canadian researcher Arthur Bray went through Smith's papers in Ottawa and found that it was that guy, Robert Sarbacher, if you can see him on the right, on your right. Sarbacher was a brilliant scientist, well plugged in at the time, and was identified in Smith's handwritten notes. This allowed a few researchers to follow up, and they found Robert Sarbacher, who was still alive in the early 1980s. Sarbacher, this is just a fascinating detective story here. Sarbacher wrote a 2-page, single-space typewritten memo to the researcher William Steinman back in 1983, where he said, yes, actually, I spoke to Smith, and not only that, we were very interested in crash retrievals of UFOs. The discussion that we had was that these beings were shaped kind of like insects, which might have allowed them to withstand the tremendous forces and so forth of Earth's atmosphere. This was him talking years later to Steinman. He mentioned a lot more in this memo, confirming again, that within the high levels of a classified world, people were deeply interested. Sarbacher led researchers to Eric Walker, down there at the bottom. Eric Walker was a longtime president of Penn State University, a very close, good friend of Dwight Eisenhower, and head of one of the most prominent defense think tanks in the country, the Institute of Defense Analyses. Walker was big time involved in managing UFO crash retrievals. And Grant Cameron, Canadian researcher, did a really excellent job of bringing this story out in one of his books. So, and there were a number of interviews that people did with Walker where he initially, I think caught off guard, confirmed the existence of organizations like MJ-12 and confirmed the reality of crash retrievals and so on, and then just clammed up and then just made himself completely unavailable. But it's a fascinating story, I think strongly confirming. Then you have aerospace aviation journalist James Goodall, who talked about this as well. Goodall had people in Groom Lake that he cultivated, that is Area 51 and the whole area there. Did a lot of interviews, we're talking 1980s and 90s, where he said, look, my sources tell me there were at least 8 highly classified black programs flying out of Groom Lake, not counting the B-2, including a silent flying triangle. We're talking 1980s here. And, you know, famously, one of his contacts said, yes, absolutely, UFOs exist. Goodall says, can you tell me a little bit more about this? The guy says, nope. Another occasion, he has the contact says to him, we have things out of Nevada that would make George Lucas envious, better than Star Trek or anything you see in the movies. Says this back in 1985, 1986. All right, Goodall says, could you expand on that? The guy says, nope. James Goodall talked a lot about this at great length. And Goodall is a responsible, very mainstream sort of a journalist. And these are the stories he was getting. So you really have to wonder what's going on. We've got some capabilities. Mark McCandlish is here this weekend. This is really his story, but I'm just including it for one particular slide here. I consider this a very important story. The Alien Reproduction Vehicle, the ARV. Long story short here, Brad Sorensen, a friend of Mark McCandlish, was a well-placed person within the aviation community out in California. They were going to go to an air show together. McCandlish had to back out at the last minute because of a deadline. Sorensen takes a highly ranking defense colleague, a friend of the family, a very powerful guy. They go to an even better air show at Lockheed's Helendale facility where Sorensen, behind a screen, behind a curtain, sees 3 flying saucer craft hovering silently. He looks to see if they're being suspended by anything. They're not being suspended by anything. He later said something like, my senses went on high alert. I was very observant. He said there was a 4-star general speaking about these at a podium, calling them, referring to them as the alien reproduction vehicles, and indicating that they had traversed the solar system. This is 1988, shortly after the election of George Bush over Michael Dukakis, and that they had gone through the solar system. And if I recall correctly, Sorensen, I think, observed they sure looked like they'd been put through their paces. They didn't look like they were factory fresh. It was very interesting. They were hovering. And so on. And this is this is a technical illustration that McCandlish did based on Sorensen's observations. You have George Knapp, the journalist with KLAS out of Las Vegas, and great guy and a very knowledgeable person in this field, who's the one who brought out Bob Lazar's claims back in 1989. But George Knapp is interviewed, actually, I should say not more than a dozen, more like 2 dozen Area 51 insiders that he has spoken to, which he has said corroborate all different aspects of Lazar's claims. A number of these people were ready to go public with him and were threatened and did not go public, and George has talked about this a number of times. So there's obviously things going on. You've got the Nellis UFO from November 94. Some people have said this may be a version of the ARV. I don't know. At times it looks like it. At times it doesn't look like it. It seems to change its shape. This was leaked to the television show Hard Copy. There's been some very detailed analyses done of this. One by Dave Rudiak and one by gentleman named Martin Powell, I believe. You can do an analysis because the film that was released has data dealing with the altitude and azimuth and speed of the object and so forth, and they were able to calculate all kinds of things. So it went as slow as 15 miles per hour, as fast as 500, all within a couple of minutes. Did a right angle turn at about 140 miles per hour. Pretty interesting stuff. You hear, this is on YouTube, you hear the Nellis operators saying things like, what is that? Is that a helicopter? What is that? They didn't know what it was. Gary McKinnon, who has been here with us this weekend via Skype, famously, almost 20 years ago now, was going through looking into U.S. Space Command websites and related government sites looking for evidence of UFOs, and then found in November 2000 a list of officers' names under the heading non-terrestrial officers. Saw much more. This led to the operation known as Solar Warden. Certain things he couldn't remember. This is before you could do screenshots. It was 2000. It was a different era, really. Very difficult to do captures, data captures from your screen at that time. He saw images. He saw a lot that made him convinced that there was indeed a secret space program. The thing about McKinnon, of course, is that the U.S. government tried for about a decade to extradite him, and the rumor was that they wanted to throw him into Guantanamo Bay. Wherever they wanted him to go, they wanted him, and considered him a major. I mean, they really blew out of proportion the damage he did. Millions of dollars in damage. Sure, I don't think so, but they wanted him. Sometime at certain points, they called him like the greatest hacker in modern history. Not true. I don't even think you could call him a hacker per se. But anyway, McKinnon is not in danger of extradition, thankfully. Oh yeah, this is a quote that actually Michael mentioned last night. I like this quote as well. This is from Ronald Reagan's diaries. The diary is legit, and people can discuss the accuracy of the information, but Reagan did write in June of 1985 in his diaries. He said, had lunch with 5 top space scientists. It was fascinating. I learned that our shuttle capacity is such that we could orbit 300 people. And as anyone who looked at the shuttle program knows, at the time and now, I mean, our capacity is, officially speaking, nothing like that whatsoever, not even remotely close to that. So what was Reagan talking about? Was there a classified component of our space program that he was made aware of, maybe a military component? There's a lot of interesting night vision. This is one. This is one that I like from, I guess this is a clip, I thought. This is a flying triangle. Sure as heck looks like it to me. I'm going to show you a video clip of it. This is night vision from Fremont, California, December 2008. And you'll see this object moving along. It's pretty clear. It's probably not extraterrestrials. I'm sure that's something that we're making. It's pretty cool looking. It's about a decade ago. There's an image of it there, a screenshot. There's a fellow in Vancouver I've chatted with who is, the thing is, once people start getting into night vision and recording this, they can become obsessed. It's very easy to do because you really start finding things. So this is a gentleman in Vancouver who has very excellent equipment. His name is Charles Lamoureux. There he is. And he just captures interesting things. And, some of these, maybe they're insects. Some of them are not insects. I don't know what some of these things are. This is an object with a hole in the middle. It seems to move around and drift. It's not moving with precision. And this is him. He says 4 times speed to demonstrate the saucer spin or wobble. And there you go. So a lady I know who, I don't know if she wants her name out there or not. She's somewhat known to a number of researchers. Very, very knowledgeable person about drones. She lives in Arkansas. She has seen a lot of high-quality drones. She uses Generation 3 night vision And this is what she said to me. There are all kinds of craft up there. Military art, research and development drones, drone triangles, and even what she called a huge rectangular craft, which she saw in daylight. She says, I've seen these craft cloak. I saw one cloak over my house at treetop level, and I tell you, it could not be seen at all, and I was only about 50 yards away. I've also seen these drones from less than 30 feet, and there is no movement, no vibration, nothing. They look as though they are glued to the sky. Some of these sightings are in the daytime. They're not all at night. And she talked about daytime cloaking technology, too. I will just add, this is a lady who has requisitioned hundreds, not simply hundreds of pages, but hundreds of documents, U.S. military drone technology documents that she has. She's as much of an expert in the civilian world as anyone you'll ever meet. Now, here's something that, comes as an obvious little objection. So if you think that we've recovered crash retrievals of UFOs, if we're studying them in the classified world, if we're trying to build them and go out of Earth's orbit, if we're using technologies that are a little bit better than our petroleum-based stuff and jet propulsion and so forth, if they're using anything remotely like free energy or radical propulsion dealing with electrogravitics, we would have to recognize that that's a very radical thing for our society, and there might be individuals and forces at work that would not want that to get out to the rest of us. It's not really hard to imagine this whatsoever. We have a petroleum-based global infrastructure. We have a petrodollar. Every single thing the United States does in the world is based on maintaining the dollar as the source of petroleum transactions worldwide. It's called the petrodollar, and that's slipping away, by the way, but the U.S. is still holding on as tight as it can. So everything is based on petroleum, and if petroleum were to be replaced in any way, let's say there's a secret within UFO technology that goes beyond petroleum, then clearly it's disruptive. And it could be great. It could be great for us, but it could be very disruptive for our society. And it also could have dangerous implications for society. You might trust yourself with free energy, but could you trust your next door neighbor with free energy, or everyone in your city? If someone were able to make a weapon based that powers itself on free energy, or there's a lot of possibilities you can think about, and there might be reasons that there would be secrecy about this subject. And the challenge would be to release that technology and maintain safety of the population. That might be very difficult to do. Maybe possible, but it might be difficult. And then at the fundamental level, and what I've been focusing on for a long time is presumably releasing this technology would create a challenge to our current hierarchy in our world. So therefore, that being the case, I would argue you have a system that is predicated on black budgets, that is secret spending. You can't let the public know that you've got this technology. You can't then let them know that you're developing radical technologies in a potential breakaway civilization. It's probably predicated on great financial corruption as well, if nothing else, to fund it and to make money off of it. Political corruption goes without saying. Classification of the technologies, weaponizing the technologies. Thanks to John Burroughs, we are much more knowledgeable about the Condign report released in 2006 by the UK government. This was a classified UK military study from the late 90s where they talked about very openly needing to weaponize UAP technology, that is UFOs. The system has to be predicated on controlling the media. It must. This is not a matter of negotiation for these guys. The media, that is CNN and all the other mainstream, they're like the modern day version of church. That's where the information gets out. Even if people don't really watch CNN in their living room, it's still the dominant voice. It is the establishment, and that establishment voice must be controlled at all times. What I would, maybe this is hyperbole, but I don't think so. I would say it is predicated on a kind of global totalitarianism. I do think that we're moving very much in that direction. And so with this tremendous secret about classified technology and about a need for being in space covertly, using who knows what kind of technology. And I don't know, by the way, how advanced the technology is. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But no matter what it is, it would be very difficult for them to undo the secrecy without messing up pretty much everything. I will say, since I credit the 1988 ARV story, and I do credit other similar stories that deal with reverse engineering, flying disc and flying saucer technology, it's not outrageous to me to consider that we've gone to the moon covertly and even gone to Mars covertly. Not out of the world, not out of the question whatsoever to me. I leave that as a definite, distinct possibility. Oh yes, another conversation I had with a very interesting scientist, a very highly classified, well-connected scientist who just simply tossed out, he said, look, every 5 years or so, we have conversations at the highest levels as to whether or not we should initiate a disclosure process. That is, I don't know if he used the word disclosure, I don't think he did, but essentially an ending of the secrecy and telling the world what the real deal is relating to UFOs. And he said, in every 5 years or so, whenever it comes up, we always seem to make the decision, nope, not a good idea at this time. This particular man was on a subcommittee. There are different subcommittees to study the implications of the end of secrecy. His subcommittee was legal implications of disclosure, even though he's not a lawyer. He is quite intelligent. And he said the implication was, look, even class action lawsuits alone would be a really serious issue. Think of defense contractors. Some defense contractors might have an inside track because they have access to ET Tech, whereas another one wouldn't. Unfair trade practices. Easy lawsuit. That's such a mundane consideration. But it makes you think. There's probably many, many others. I think that the most likely overall scenario, this is my big picture scenario, is that we've had crash retrievals, military encounters. I didn't even talk about that, but in some of the FOIA documents we have, they talk about these again and again, where military craft are chasing UFOs. I've spoken about this many, many times at other events and in my books. This is a very, very significant aspect of what's going on in the UFO situation. Requiring absolute secrecy, total control, that's a given. Black budgets, illegal financing of the program, causing what I would say would be a kind of runaway secrecy and a runaway privatized secrecy. That is, not simply DOD and Pentagon people, but contractors, where the real money is anyway. And it's never been clear to anyone who really dominates. Do the contractors or the DOD personnel? And there have been arguments, and many of them, in fact, and they're not trivial arguments, that say the real power, honestly, is with the contractors. Engaged in weaponizing these technologies, hiding their breakthroughs when they need to, creating what I've called a breakaway civilization, secret space program, in a desperate attempt to catch up to these others, whoever they are, whatever they are, and a paralysis of disclosure. In other words, just being afraid to disclose, because to keep a secret like this for so long, you create an infrastructure, detailed infrastructure of secrecy. How do you give up this secret after 70 plus years now of this secret going full guns? It's very difficult. How far does the secrecy go? How advanced might such a black budget breakaway civilization be? I'm getting toward the end here. Let me make sure. Yes, okay, good. So let me just talk a little bit about this. My ultimate answer is I don't know how far they go. All right, I don't know. Does the black budget world have full-blown quantum computing? Maybe. James Bamford, who did probably the best studies on the NSA of anyone that I know, a couple of years ago said he thought it was a 50-50 gamble that the NSA had functioning quantum computing at that time, around 2014 or so. He didn't know. Where are they in terms of AI? How far advanced is classified artificial intelligence? Again, I don't know the answer to this. And I don't know if there's anyone in this room who really knows the answer to this. There are people who claim to have answers to these things. I don't know how they know such things. So if we've mastered, let's say, propulsion technology that allows us to go off-world, let's say that that's happened. I think that's actually a reasonable likelihood. With 50 plus, 60 plus years of studying this, is it likely that they've made breakthroughs? Yes, absolutely. I think it's very likely they've made breakthroughs in going beyond petroleum and fossil fuels. That being the case, would we have been able to develop our own flying saucers to go to the moon covertly? Yes, absolutely. We got that capability. To me, that's very likely and almost, I would say, probable. What other kind of technologies are likely? Time travel technology. People love to talk about this one. This is very widely circulating. And I don't know. I mean, I've never seen any indication, none, that makes me think that this actually is a viable operational technology. And I just want to point out, and then I don't say this as a strong criticism, but it was pointed out in the lecture last night by Michael about time regression. You know, it is a claim that, and let me just move on to the next slide here. I might as well, because I am getting toward the end. For example, Corey Good, who's here, and he'll be speaking, that he, and I've talked with Corey, and he's been very decent with me. I just want to make this very clear. The idea about time regression, though, I find personally a bit problematic. I've said this to him. I've said this to the world. You go somewhere for 20 years, and you are then age regressed and time regressed back to your house, as if no one ever knew you left, but you spent 20 years. So is such a thing possible? Well, he says it's possible, and that it happened. I'm saying I don't believe that. I'm just saying I don't believe that. Is it impossible? I guess not. I don't know. Michael pointed out last night that we've got now scientists talking about age regression in mice, an article from a couple of years ago. And I would say, yes, that's fascinating, but that's still a far, far distance from age and time regression for instant regression back to where you were. It's a totally different kind of technology, and involving a lot of other factors, not just biology and genetics, but physics and much, much more. So I'm not quite convinced, and we can continue this conversation at the panel, I'm sure, tomorrow, that that's really a valid example of, you know, the secret world back in the late 60s, early 70s, supposedly doing time regression. I am not yet convinced that that's a valid statement to make, and there's no evidence for it. The main thing that I want to say about this is simply, and this is my opinion, some of the claims are not logical to me. There's a failure of evidence in most of these claims, at least when you get down to the core of what is being alleged. There is no evidence that you can check or that I can check to verify. There's a principle that I like to bring out and remind us all, many of you know about falsifiability. If something's falsifiable, it doesn't mean that it's false. It means that you have the ability to test it. You have the ability to check to see whether it's true or false. That's a fundamental principle of science and philosophy. And if something is not falsifiable, it could be true. It could completely be true. But philosophically, it's not valid. It's not valid because you're only going on trust. You're going on what someone says. Trust me, this happened. I know you can't test it, you can't check it, but I'm telling you it's true. And in my view, this is not the way for us to move forward in ufology. We can't move forward in ufology based on trust. We have an entire world outside this room that has got us in their crosshairs, and they want us to fail. They want to see us crash and burn. And if we were to do that, that would be a horrible tragedy, because we are on a subject that is the most fascinating, important subject of our time, in my opinion. And so it is incumbent and imperative on all of us who are doing research or promoting the subject in any way with the public to be as factually based, when we're dealing especially with the rest of the world, to be as factually based as we're able to be. Now, it's not always possible. It is not always possible. As a researcher, I have received stories that I cannot confirm. Other researchers, the same thing. That's how it is. And we're also dealing with a subject that not simply, intrinsically on its own merits, is probably one of the most difficult subjects we can imagine, because in all likelihood, we're dealing with an intelligence that's operating way beyond our own capability. But on top of that, we're dealing with government secrecy and obfuscation and lies and deception, for obvious reasons. So we are severely handicapped in trying to get to the bottom of this amazing, incredible mystery. And for that reason as well, I feel that we are not served by stating as fact claims that cannot be falsified or proven one way or the other. It's totally fair to talk about them. It's totally fair to make the claims. But we need to remind ourselves what can be verified and what is not possible to be verified. And if something is not possible to be verified, we're all very wise to tread a lot more carefully when we are, as we're trying to move forward in this field. The only other thing I'm going to say, and I'm not accusing anyone of anything here, I want to be clear about this, but it is absolutely a fact of United States history, going back decades and generations, of government interference in all kinds of organizations. Many of you have heard of COINTELPRO from the FBI back in the 50s and 60s, where J. Edgar Hoover authorized FBI infiltrating and disrupting other of a range of organizations, civilian organizations, to discredit them and destroy them. That was not a unique moment in American history. This goes on to this day. Just a few years ago, during the Obama years, U.S. Judge Cass Sunstein wrote a very famous paper talking explicitly about the need for the U.S. government to infiltrate, I don't think he used the word anti-American, but dangerous organizations, conspiracy theory groups, people like us, to infiltrate and disrupt those organizations, doing it with information warfare. As you go into those organizations and you disrupt them with fake information, you cause infighting and things of this particular sort. And we know this happened through some of the Snowden revelations, not through US, but through Britain's GCHQ, that's their NSA. They explicitly developed a PowerPoint presentation on exactly this type of activity, going in, infiltrating, disrupting activities of their organization. So we are fools if we fail to recognize that this possibility always exists. And again, I accuse no one here or anywhere of doing it because I don't know. But all of these have to be kept in mind. So when we are looking at evidence, all right, or when we are looking at claims, we need to ask ourselves, does this qualify as actual evidence, or is it just an interesting story? If it's an interesting story, we can still listen to it, we can still ponder it and reflect on it, but that's another step from saying this is confirmed. And I feel that that's where we are wisest, if we are able to do that. I don't know if I've gone over or not, but that's all I've got for you. And I want to thank you so much for having me back here. Very, very much. Thank you. And check